I want to show you something really, really cool. This is the Cam E2F6. It's a terrible name, but it's a really cool camera. I'm going to tell you why. We're going to look at the Cam E2F6 full frame 6K cinema camera. This comes with an EF mount or a PL mount for $4,000. There are some limitations here, so don't get too excited. But if you've never heard of this camera or you only know a little bit about it, we're going to go through kind of the specs here and just really see all this thing has to offer. I haven't personally shot with it myself, but it is very, very tempting considering all that this thing can do. Does it say Canon on it? No. Is it Nikon? Is it Panasonic? Is it Sony? No, but I think that's what makes it kind of fun and kind of special, especially when people say the R5 is a photography camera, so who cares if it overheats? If you want a video camera, buy a video camera or a cinema camera. I think this might be the camera those people are talking about. Let's take a look. $4,000 gets you a full frame 6K camera. And not only is it 6K, it's actually 6K 60. So you can do slow-mo 6K, you can do 4K 120. In fact, let's pop down to the specs. This is what I find the most helpful part on B&H is that they have a specs section for almost all of their products. Full frame sensor. We've got ISOs low to high, as you'd expect on most cameras. If you're shooting cinema, I imagine you're shooting with some light. So I don't know how this performs in low light, but I'm gonna guess it's maybe not on par with the A7S III, but I don't expect it to be terrible. 15 stops dynamic range advertised, maybe a little bit less, but in practice, I think most of us are kind of used to the 12, 13, 14 stops range of what's been more or less common. Maybe it's 11 on the low side, 9, 10 on some cameras, but really like respectable. I think most of the time, no one expects to film the surface of the sun and like the deepest, darkest shadows and keep it all exposed evenly. In some cases, when you do the HDR stuff, it just looks weird anyway. Lens mounts on this is EF, or you can get the PL version. You can do shutter angle. There aren't any built-in ND filters, so that's what would separate it from something like the Ursa Mini Pro, which does have built-in NDs, or some of the Sony cameras or the Canon cameras that have that built-in ND filter wheel. Some of them are electronic now, kind of moving that direction. No built-in NDs on the Cam E2. Unfortunately, I always like to have them built in so that they're there. But again, we're looking at a $4,000 camera on par with other hybrids in this class, what I would equate with the Lumix S1H, a full-frame mirrorless hybrid, the Sony A7S III hybrid mirrorless camera, the Canon R5. None of them have built-in NDs either. Would it set this apart a little bit more? Yeah, it would. You've got a bunch of different internal recording options. You can do RAW, of course. It's a cinema camera. Most cinema cameras, if they say they're cinema cameras, they should be doing RAW nowadays. We've got H.265, MOV, MP4. This is 420 10-bit and 420 8-bit. You have a bunch of options here. You can get 422 10-bit over HDMI if you're using an external recorder, which in this case, if you notice, it doesn't come with an LCD, so you would likely have one of those anyway if you needed that. Get something like the Atomos Ninja 5 or equivalent, maybe something older or a different brand, doesn't really matter to me, but something that you can monitor and record, because you want to likely set that up with this camera anyway, just for being able to use it. So it's not quite only $4,000. There's some additions there that would drive the price up a little bit. But if you want the 422 10-bit over HDMI, it's there. There is one HDMI output. There's no HDSDI. That can be a pro or a con depending on how you look at it. I kind of like to have both, just because HDSDI is a little bit better. You know, you have the locking mechanism. HDMI is a little bit more consumerish, but most monitors take it, so it's kind of the standard, even though it's not the best input-output for, you know, secure, consistent recording. But just be careful. And then there's some other inputs and outputs. You have some wireless features. You have the status display, and then it does take Sony L batteries. So these are more of the camcorder style that come in a variety of sizes. So you can get bigger batteries, smaller batteries, depending on your needs. You're not limited to just like an LPE6, which is like the one standard size that you can't really get a bigger one, which is one of the drawbacks of the Blackmagic pocket cinema camera, is that it relies on those traditional DSLR batteries that are kind of small and don't have enough juice to record for a while. We've got operating temperatures. I don't imagine this thing's going to overheat. I guess it could. I haven't tested it myself. These are pretty standard operating temperatures, same as like the GH5 and many other cameras, up to 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius. You can store it at higher temperatures if you want, but I wouldn't recommend it. Why make your gear excessively hot if you don't need to? And some weights and dimensions down here. Now, as you can imagine, it's missing a few things. This isn't a hybrid camera in that I'm sure you can take photos with it. You could take still frames or whatever, but it's not a photography camera. It's not meant for that purpose. I believe it does do autofocus, but again, probably not at that hybrid DSLR, mirrorless. You know, you're taking photos because it's a photography camera as well. This is definitely more in the cinema class, where if it has autofocus, it might function kind of like it does on the Blackmagic cameras, where it's there, but I don't ever use it because it's not reliable, and it's just not how I shoot with those cameras. And you don't have the internal stabilization, the IBIS, that you're getting on a lot of the newer cameras like the A7S III, the S1H, the R5. All these cameras have that internal image stabilization right on the sensor, as well as pairing it with the image stabilization you get with lenses. And you can get some really, really stable shots just shooting completely handheld. So hopefully that paints a pretty good picture of what this camera is, why I think it's kind of cool, and the price. But let me show you something even cooler. And this is what is maybe most exciting for me, because I just like the weird quirks, the weird workarounds, the stuff that's a little bit obtuse. You'll notice the E2-F6 is the full frame version, but there's also an E2-S6, which would be the Super 35 version. And you'll notice for the Super 35 version, you can get it with a Micro Four Thirds mount. Now granted, this is back ordered on P&H right now, but look at the price drop and how that dropped down to $2,600. So now you're at the price of an R6, the budget new Canon hybrid mirrorless video camera that's not a video camera, that's just meant for photos, but it has some cool video features, except you can't use them because it overheats. You've got a Super 35 sensor with a Micro Four Thirds mount and the price of an R6, but it's not full frame, except Micro Four Thirds, you can use Speed Booster. And this reminds me a lot of the JVC LS300. This is a weird camera. Not a lot of people own one. I rented one for a shoot one time. Loved everything about it. You know, everything you could want is on this camera. Built-in NDs. It's got a Super 35 sensor. It shoots 4K. It has a Micro Four Thirds mount, so you can put a speed booster on it, and now you're speed boosting, you're focal reducing to Super 35 from full frame glass, because almost all of your lenses will be if you're a full frame shooter. Like if you have a bunch of Canon lenses or Nikon lenses or whatnot, you can, because it's a mirrorless mount, you have extra room to put an adapter on there, meaning you can put a speed booster on there and get a full frame, kind of a fake full frame equivalent on a camera like this. Very few of these exist, right? A Super 35 sensor with a Micro Four Thirds mount. Kind of weird, kind of strange, because you could use Micro Four Thirds lenses on there, but then those lenses are designed for even a smaller sensor, Micro Four Thirds, than Super 35 or APS-C would be the kind of photography equivalent. So why would you want to do this? Well, interesting enough, the Cam E2-F6 with the Super 35 will shoot 6K 75, 14 stops dynamic range. Let's go down to the specs. Take a look. Keep in mind, if you put a speed booster on this, you get that full frame field of view. Now, is it really full frame? No. And there's going to be some people who nitpick it to death. But you're looking at $2,500, $2,600 with a speed booster, $3,000 probably. Maybe you already have one because you're shooting with the GH5 or something similar. And you can do up to 120 frames, 4K, with all the nice cinema benefits we talked about on the F6. So we've got raw 10-bit if you want. We've got the 420 10-bit and all the flavors. We've got the audio recording, the 422 external. Again, you're going to have an external monitor display to also probably record on, since most of them do that nowadays. And kind of the same things, the benefits of the kind of bigger camcorder style batteries, and your weight specs again. So why do I think that's so cool and interesting and fun? Well, because the price is significantly cheaper, and you could theoretically get a full frame looking camera for a fraction of the cost, and you get all the benefits of the mirrorless mount. The one thing about the EF mount is that the mount itself is built with a mirror box in the camera in mind. This is, you know, holdover from DSLR days. Now everything's going mirrorless. We've got a lot of hybrid cameras, and that distance between the lens and the sensor, the flange distance, is a lot smaller with all these things. So Micro Four Thirds being one of the earliest kind of mirrorless mounts. You've also got the Sony EMount. That was one of the early mirrorless mounts. But the EF mount is kind of becoming a little bit dated. It's kind of more old school, even though that sounds weird to say because I have a bunch of EF lenses. It still is this old legacy mount, and you can't do a lot with it. You can't adapt a lot to it. So if you bought this Cam E2-F6 or the F6, the Super 35 version, or the full frame version, you get the EF mount, you can adapt some lenses to it, but it's not as universal as something that's mirrorless, where there's a lot more adapters. Cheap dummy adapters to smart adapters to speed boosters, all sorts of cool, fun stuff you can do. You can even do some macro adapter type things just to put a little bit more distance in there if you want to limit like your lens and do some cool stuff to play around with it. There's even some tilt shift adapters. I have one over here that I don't use as much as I probably should, but you just have flexibility when you have the mirrorless mount. And the fact that you can get a Super 35 sensor, not a Micro Four Thirds sensor, with a Micro Four Thirds mount, I think is really, really intriguing. Now, it is back ordered on B&H right now. And this isn't the only thing that Zcam makes. If you go over to their website, they actually have quite a few products that it might be interesting to check out. Lots of VR stuff, from professional VR cameras to cinematic VR cameras, all sorts of neat, fun things to play around with if you're so inclined. Now, I don't really know much about this brand, other than the few people who have purchased these cameras seem to like them, and you'll see the reviews online are fairly positive. There are almost all the reviews on B&H, regarding the full frame one, are fairly positive. I think they're all 5 stars probably. Now, is that early adopters who are just really excited? Oh, there's 1 4-star or 2 4 stars. So work in progress, but like no one's giving this 1 star. Again, I haven't personally shot with it, but if you're looking for something where it's more in that cinema class for all the people who say the R5 isn't a video camera, it overheats, so just take photos, that's what it's meant for. It's meant for photographers, which I think is a nonsense argument. But let's just say you took those people with their argument. Don't give Canon your money. Consider something like this, or the Pocket Cinema camera from Blackmagic, or the Lumix S1H, or the new A7S III. Like, there are plenty of cameras in this price point that do really, really high-end video features. And so when people say you need to buy a proper cinema camera or a real video camera, it's like this kind of like, get out of here and go spend $50,000 on a Red, which is like, it's dumb. Like, these cameras are all very equally priced. So that's why I kind of rag on Canon a little bit, just because it's like they have a camera that's the same price as all these other ones. They're advertising similar features, yet they can't do it, but everyone else can. So a little bit of quirks here with, you'd probably want some kind of like hand grip, or maybe if you only shoot on a tripod, that's fine. But a lot of people like the box, hardware design, just so that they can rig it out with whatever they want, the accessories of their choosing. Very, very flexible, very functional. There's only 1 card slot. I don't know if that's a big deal to some people. I typically like to only have 1 card in the camera, just because it makes it really obvious and kind of bulletproof of what's being recorded. There's many, many times where if you have 2 cards in a camera, the camera can record to like the second card and you think it's going to the first, or vice versa. And it can be a little confusing, especially if you're on a set with a crew and someone's using a camera that they're not quite familiar with. I just like to keep it really simple, really straightforward. Give someone a card, say, hey, this is what you're shooting on, give it back to me, and then I know the footage is on there. So the 1 card versus 2 card thing really isn't a deal breaker either way. It is nice that it's there in those situations where you just need to keep recording continuously and you need that overflow. But honestly, I have had it on the GH5 for years, and I have it on the Ursa Mini Pro, and most of the time I put 1 card in both those cameras. So just something interesting to check out if you're so inclined, this Cam E2F6 or the S6 for that matter. I have a speed booster, so that wouldn't be any extra cost. The only additional cost would be maybe an external recorder or monitor, but a lot of people already have those too. So could be something really interesting to play around with, and you save $1,500 at the end of the day. So I like that. I like the fun, quirky little things that maybe it's the intent. I don't know if that's why they designed it Super 35 with Micro Four Thirds, so you could do that, but I like kind of thinking outside the box. That's what JVC did with the LS300, and that's what I think Panasonic should embrace more of with the GH6, or however that line evolves in the future. So check it out. If you haven't considered it and you're looking to have something that's video cinema forward, wish it had the built-in NDs. But hey, if you get the EF mount, the F mount, you're going to be limited. But if you get the Micro Four Third mount, now you have adapters that have NDs built in. There's like the VisileX ND throttle. There's a few other adapters where you can slot NDs behind the lens. I don't know if I prefer one way or the other, in front of the lens or behind. I think they both have their pros and cons. Behind the lens, though, is just kind of more convenient if it's always there, but it does get in the way if you wanted to put a speed booster there. To my knowledge, there isn't a speed booster and ND combo, although that is something that Metabone should definitely do, or anyone could do if you could make it fit. But I don't know that there's quite enough room in that distance to fit both the optics for the speed booster and an ND. But something to keep in mind, if you do want to go that route, you could get an adapter with, you know, a variable ND built right into it, so you have the Super 35 sensor, which is, you know, cinema standard, with a mirrorless mount that's very flexible, very adaptable. So check it out and see what you think, because it definitely has me intrigued, and hopefully one day I can get my hands on it and play around with it. I'm gonna pop over into the chat, and there's nothing, so I'm just gonna move right along. Now is a very interesting time dealing with COVID, the aftermath, what the future looks like, how things have changed as a society, and how that affects the filmmaking industry, as videographers, as cinematographers, video professionals, photographers as well. Weddings haven't been the same, events, sports, all of these things have been disrupted in a way that is very meaningful to a lot of people's livelihoods. And what do you do, and what's the path forward? And I think when you look at this, it can be kind of depressing to think of all the limitations and the restrictions and how things have changed for the worse, where we were before and now what we have to deal with. But if you're watching this, maybe you're like me and you can look at it as an opportunity. And I would encourage you to do that. Challenge yourself to look in the ways that you can shape and adapt your business and what you do to adapt to the times in a way that may in the long run get you in a place that's better than where you are now or where you were before. The example I want to pull up is this article from ET Online. Is that Entertainment Tonight, I assume. I'm not big into the entertainment news and gossip and all that, but I thought this article was interesting, talking about the movies and television that are resuming production after a coronavirus shutdown. So this was published just a couple days ago, and they're talking about the late night shows, talking about things like The Witcher. If you watch season 1, now they're going to start back up with season 2 because that production was delayed. And you can see kind of up front, they just talk about, you know, the show must go on. Following global shutdowns of film and television productions due to the coronavirus, which then prompted a major shuffling of release schedules. Things have been delayed. There's just chaos and people having to adapt to a changing time. Like, I'm still waiting for Tenet to come out. I really am really excited to see Tenet, and I wish it was just on demand, but I get it. They want it to be in the theater, but come on, I'm really excited to see Tenet. Both Hollywood and the industry at large are ready to get cameras rolling again. I think a lot of us are. Maybe you have been already, or you're just getting back into it. Whatever the case is, we're at this point where things maybe are starting back up again, but it still feels a little hazy, a little murky as to what the future holds. This article says, as the world moves into the next phase of the ongoing pandemic, large-scale productions, including the Avatar sequels and Jurassic World Dominion, have announced plans to resume filming, and then below they break it down. So you can read through the article if you want, but I thought this was interesting in the fact that there's even a Wikipedia page dedicated to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on television. And this is regional, like across the globe. You can see everything that's happened. You read through this. We're not going to read through it right now, but there's a lot of detail here. It has a Wikipedia page for the impact of this. Now, granted, everything has a Wikipedia page, but I still think that's, you know, it's a nice consolidated place to look at it. But anyway, let's talk about the opportunities that are presented with everything that's going on. If you look at how Hollywood traditionally does production, it's big, it's expensive, there's a lot of people, really crushing work schedules, and restrictions, and a lot about it is big and bloated because it's massive and it's this machine, this industry machine. When you present something like the situation we're all going through right now, that machine isn't going to get up and running maybe as smoothly as some people might expect or might hope. When you're worried about social distancing or masks and you have to deal with actors and their faces on camera and hygiene and all this stuff that people are worried about right now, it puts even more restrictions on an industry that's already bogged down by a lot of restrictions in terms of where you can film, where you can't film, who can do what. Oh, you're not qualified to move that light stand, so we need to hire another person to do it. You know, kind of the silly stories you hear about Hollywood. But in general, you have a big industry that's now being interrupted and having to refigure everything out. Who's at a better advantage? The independent people or the big Hollywood production studios? I think the independent people are at a better advantage. And when you look at the drought of content that may be coming, services like Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, HBO, these services are at record highs in terms of viewership because people are at home. They're watching content. They're not going to the movies. They're watching movies on Disney+. These services are going to be desperate for content. Meanwhile, the industry that's been supporting them for the past 10 years has now been on hiatus, and now as they move back into things, they're going to be experiencing problems. I don't take joy in that. I think it's kind of unfortunate that these things, that they have to deal with all this stuff. But it is a silver lining for the people who are more independent. If you can find a way to make compelling, interesting content, given the fact that we have cameras that shoot broadcast quality cinematic 4K, 6K. If you look at the Lumix S1H, it's rated for Netflix production. A mirrorless camera, that's $4,000. I'm sure many of the other devices that you can get your hands on out there are equally as good. Movies were filmed decades ago with digital cameras that were released. 28 Days Later, famous example, right? There's many, many of those. Always Sunny in Philadelphia, I believe their first season they shot on the DVX 100. There are time and time again, there are always case studies of it doesn't always matter what it was captured on. It could be standard def, it could be HD, it could be 4K, whatever. It's about the storytelling, it's about the ingenuity and the creativity, which I think often comes from restrictions and limitations. When someone says you have no budget, you can't have actors, you can't do these things, you only have access to these locations, you have all these restrictions as an independent creator, and you're put under that pressure, amazing creativity can come from that, especially in an area where now these companies, these streaming services are going to be looking for more content. Where are the independent creators out there who are making things that are interesting and unique in terms of content? Where are those people? The people who maybe were just doing corporate work before. Maybe that corporate work has dried up and there you don't have any clients. Maybe this gives you a window of opportunity to make something in more of the short film category or series format, put it on the internet, cross your fingers, and maybe you can get discovered or you share it with the right people. Like, I don't know exactly what it's going to take for you personally to get down the path, but I know that right now, oftentimes like these, where there's big change and kind of upset in industries, are turning points where some people are able to break down those doors and get access to stuff that wasn't available before. You think of the early days of YouTube, and a lot of stars now, celebrities, even Justin Bieber came from YouTube, right? The early days when this was this brand new thing and people were creating content at home and just putting it on the internet for free. Hollywood, TV, movies, they're slow to adapt and they don't always quite get it because they're built on an industry that's been given different parameters, different restrictions. It's grown over time into something that is inherently unique and is what it is. All the people who are at home who fancy themselves as content creators as well, but maybe haven't had the opportunity, I'd say challenge yourself. Look at this like an opportunity. What can you do creatively? What restrictions working with in your current situation, your current environment, can you still find a way to make interesting content? You see this with a lot of YouTubers who have been stuck at home and they can't do their normal thing where they're travel vlogging and doing all that stuff. Sometimes those restrictions of having to stay at home can be the most rewarding creatively. And I think the same is true in terms of the potential and opportunity, not just that people are going to watch it on YouTube, but if you make something high quality and compelling, there's a chance that there might be someone who wants to buy that or work with you on something more down the road because they see, hey, you can do this and you can work with these restrictions and you can deliver content faster than these other folks who are still getting used to all the new restrictions. So it's just something to keep in mind. A lot of times we can look at situations like what's happening with the pandemic and think doom and gloom, this is awful, this is the worst, how are we going to get through this, when can we get back to the new normal or get back to the old normal? And I think try and look and find a way to say, given what we know now and how things have gone and how things are developing, we know that people are consuming digital content at all-time highs. We know that content soon will be in a drought because things have been kind of paused for 4 or 5 months. Now, is there a bunch of stuff just sitting on the shelves? Yeah, of course there is. Stuff that's been passed on and is from a couple years ago that never got published or purchased, and they'll resurrect that and put it out there and we'll say, hey, this is our new series or this is our new movie. Meanwhile, it was filmed 5 years ago. That stuff exists just sitting on a shelf somewhere. But it was passed on for a reason because it maybe wasn't, cream of the crop, top list type stuff. You look at a new situation where you need content as a streaming provider. If I'm Netflix and I go, well, I need content regularly of a high quality caliber. Where are those creators? Who are the people out there making content in this new environment and can do it cheap, or affordably, right? I'm not saying it has to be like no budget, but when you look at people and their ingenuity, if you've never seen the movie Primer, I highly encourage anyone to watch the film Primer because it's just the testament of how much can be done with very, very little. Is it the best film ever? No, but it's one of my favorite films because of the spirit of independence and making content when you don't have anything and still focusing on story, delivery, execution, quality, the best you can with your resources, trying your hardest with what you have, and swinging above your weight class, punching above your weight class to the point where someone will look at it and go, wow, that's really impressive with what you did with very little. Here's more. What can you do with more? What can you do with more? And that's always where you want to be. Prove yourself in this current time. Find a way to make it work. Stand out. I don't know what it is. I don't know what the answer is. That's why every one of us has our own creative spin we can put on these things. But I do want to challenge you. Find that silver lining. Find a way to look at the current situation and don't look at the negative stuff. It's there. It's obvious. It's talked about every day. Find your own mental positivity of how you can turn a bad situation into something that may end up being a benefit to you in the long run. I think that's really important. Just finding the silver linings and the ways to make it work because it's often so overlooked. I'm in the chat here. Good to see you back on a regular basis. Yes, it's good to be doing this regularly. It's just the motivation thing. So with me, over the past couple years, I've got 2 kids now who are like the best thing ever. I love both my boys. They are like the best thing in my life. I've always wanted to be a dad, and now that I am, it's incredible. But it's a big time commitment. It takes a lot of time there. Spending time with my wife, my job. Time gets away from you in a way that you're like, oh yeah, I'll do YouTube. I'll make some content next week, next month. Oh, time goes on and you don't do anything, and then it just becomes easy not to. I'm hesitant to say any more about my plans for the future because plans change, and I don't want to commit to something I can't maintain because that's pretty common that people say that of like, I'm back. I don't know that I'm back, but I'm doing streams now and producing content at a pace that works for me at this point in my life. In the chat, will you be getting the 12K eventually? Probably not. The Ursa Mini Pro 12K is way overkill for my needs now. Do I envision a situation in the future where I need 12K? That immediately doesn't come to mind. I can't picture a scenario where I really need the 12K. I'm far more interested in 4K 120, which granted, I know the 12K does. It does 12K, it does 8K, it does 6K, it does all. You don't have to shoot it at 12K, which is fine, but it is $10,000 body only. And if you know anything about the Ursa Mini Pro, you have to kit it out, and that's at least another $5,000 probably when you're talking about viewfinder, batteries, and etc. Now granted, you can swap, a 4-point, you can, if you have all that extra stuff, you can swap it and change it out from if you have like the 4K or the 4.6K or the Pro, because it's the same kind of hardware structure. However, I don't know that the extra cost is worth it to me right now or in the near future. I would much prefer to have something like the A7S Mark III, because that actually does things in terms of like low light and the high frame rate, high quality 4K in a body that's like handheld, which a lot of the stuff I shoot, actually, I prefer that hybrid mirrorless type of shooting. And there's a lot of people out there who criticize and say, they're photography cameras, they're not video cameras. But they do video, they have video features, they're advertised as such. And when you start shooting video that way, it opens up a whole new world of possibilities that you just can't get with an Ursa Mini Pro or even like a Red, you know, or an Alexa, some of these higher end cameras that are just bigger and bulkier. Now, granted, some of them are smaller, but like there's something so pure and essential about a camera designed for photography, meant to being like held in your hand and being portable, and you can take it anywhere and you put a lens on it and it shoots photos the way you want. Take all of those same benefits and then now it shoots video, and it shoots high quality video, and it's the right codec and it's the right frame rates, and it has the stabilization and the autofocus and like all of this stuff. It's almost like the vibe I get, and I'm sure this is not what they actually mean, but there's a lot of benefits to photography that seem like, well, if that's just for photographers, that's kind of selfish. Like, why don't the video people get that as well? Why do I have to have the bigger, bulkier, heavier camera that doesn't do autofocus, that doesn't do these things, that is more of a visual distraction when you go into some place than something that like a photographer never has to deal with? So I can't say never. Most of the time, you know, people know what a photography, you know, they know what a DSLR looks like. So they know, oh, that's a photographer. In fact, if you see those types of cameras, people just think you're taking photos. If they see something that's like the Ursa Mini Pro, then all of a sudden, oh, you're a filmmaker. What are you doing here? Oh, no, is this a commercial? Is this, you know, I'm just taking some pictures. You know, you can say that with the hybrid and still shoot video. So I really like those benefits and just how it works into the type of content I make. So that's why I'm more keen on something like an A7S III or the S1H. Was really excited for the R5 or R6, and then we saw how that turned out. So Ursa 12K, probably not in the near future, but maybe there's a reason I'm not thinking of that I would want it or need it. Maybe I'll rent it for something if I needed to do like the high frame rate type stuff, and have something that was like familiar. Back in the chat, Primer was great. Primer is excellent. It was on Netflix for a while. I don't know if it's still on Netflix. But if you've never seen Primer, check it out, because it's just the perfect execution in my mind of like what independent film ought to be like. Not being perfect, but being perfect for what it is, if that makes sense. And family comes first for sure. Yeah, but hopefully I can find a good balance. Really, the YouTube thing is just, it is a motivation, is a laziness thing. There's nothing that was keeping me from making content. Like, I had the time. Like, that's not an excuse of like, so I think I said, you know, time gets away from you, because it's not like I don't have the time. I have the time. Clearly, I'm doing it right now. But the time gets away from you where you take a day off, or you take a week off, or you say, oh, I'll get to it later, next month I'll start again. And that just delaying and procrastination is a very easy habit to then fall into, to where you're constantly saying the same things and justifying it with saying the things like, I don't have time, or I'm going to focus on family, or, you know, I'm going to do work and all this other stuff, which all that's important and all of it's valid. But a lot of times it can just be the excuse that keeps you in the lazy habits. If you're consuming content, you're not usually creating content. Like, those things don't really go hand in hand, and that's probably a video I'll do another day, just talking about the difference between like creating and consuming. I easily fall into those traps of consuming and watching content and watching Netflix and watching Amazon and get sucked into something, and when you're just consuming and you're not producing anything out there, you're not doing what I'm doing now, which is what really fuels me and gives me energy. Getting through a show is satisfying. I'm watching The Last Dance right now, the documentary on the Bulls, joint partnership between ESPN and Netflix. It's on Netflix. You can watch The Last Dance. I highly recommend it. It's fascinating and really interesting to see now, as being a kid who grew up in the 90s, watching the Bulls, falling in love with Michael Jordan at the time as being that like champion athlete hero figure. on a team. So I grew up in Iowa. If you know anything about Iowa, Iowa doesn't have any professional sports teams. There are college teams, which if you go to college in Iowa and you're from the region, then you'll be a fan of. But as a kid, when everyone else, every other state kind of has their home team, in Iowa, you don't have that. So it's kind of more of a regional thing where when I was growing up in Iowa, the kids would basically pick who was doing the best. So at one point in time, you had a lot of Cowboys fans for NFL, or you'd have the Vikings fans because Minnesota is right there. With basketball, the Bulls were just so phenomenal in the 90s that it was easily the team that, you'd have your winter jacket that was like your Bulls jacket, and you'd collect all the, I still have them probably somewhere, all my sports cards from a kid, like all my Michael Jordan cards and Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman, and just that like loving sports as a kid, but not having a team of your own for your own state. It's very easy to then just pick, well, who's doing the best? Yeah, I like the Bulls, So it's kind of funny growing up and just being, like wild-eyed and, oh my goodness, they're just so amazing. And just not even just from a sports side of things, but Michael Jordan and how he was just everywhere in terms of commercials and marketing and products and Nike and all this stuff. And then he's in Space Jam, and it's just like this overwhelming figure that's kind of what kids look up to, right? The people who are, your heroes or your role models, your idols, of like the people who just achieve so much in life and set that bar so high relative to everybody else. And then it being somebody who like you don't have, I'm being in Iowa, it's not California, so it's not like you're in Los Angeles and it's like the Lakers, which I think were the Lakers in Los Angeles at that time. I think they were. I don't follow sports all that closely. Probably because I grew up in Iowa and I saw people just change teams all the time. They just, I like the Bulls, and then, oh, no, I like the Lakers, and oh, no, it's like, I like the Spurs. And you're like, what? Don't you have any loyalty here? So long term, it makes you not kind of care about the sports because you just see how they just reset every year and players trade teams and all this. And then you go, okay, whatever. And then moving to Arizona isn't known for its sports teams, at least definitely not at that time. It was right before the Diamondbacks won the World Series against the Yankees in 2001, so we'd moved out here a little bit before that. And so also being in a state where most people are transplants from other places, so you have a lot of fans here, but they're fans for like other teams. So you almost have a situation where anytime an Arizona team is playing, like you have more fans for the out-of-state team just because there's so many people here from Chicago, from elsewhere across the country. So it's an interesting phenomenon, the whole sports thing. And then now watching The Last Dance and seeing that kind of inside look at basketball and what the culture was like and what these people were doing at the time is really, really fascinating. And just very well done. It's a really good documentary, even if you're not into sports at all, which I'm in that category. I don't really follow sports all that much, but I definitely have that nostalgia for the 90s. And it's fun to kind of relive that in this kind of new context with these like new eyes. Do you see yourself shooting a feature film? So I have shot 2 feature films technically. Now, these are not Hollywood productions. These are not even, released widely. They're not on Amazon. This was a long time ago. So I was in high school and then transitioning like right on that high school to college. And a group of us here got together and were like, let's shallow depth the field before the 5D Mark II. Okay, 5D Mark II was like, it wasn't even a thing at this point in time. And so shooting on P2 cards, again, those P2 cards for the Panasonic, each card was 4 gigabytes, which meant you could shoot 4 minutes of HD footage. And it wasn't even real HD. It was like this weird DVC Pro squashed HD. And we shot 2 feature films like that. And the Red Rock Micro adapter for the HVX200 would flip, it would invert the image. So you know how every time light goes through a lens, it flips, upside down. The camera, the HVX200, didn't let you flip the monitor, so literally had to shoot the whole thing upside down, which is really odd when you're trying to pan and tilt and things are going the wrong direction. If you've never done it, it's like the flip screen on like the GH5 that like flips the right way. Yeah, not. You couldn't do that selfie style on the HVX200, and or at least would it? Maybe it would flip it, but it was impossible to get the right orientation for the camera except for standing on the front side of the camera and like looking down at it So you're kind of upside down and like working backwards. Very, very not how I would recommend, but it was really fun at the time, being younger, not having a lot of experience, just getting into video and filmmaking. I had started a little bit younger than that. So I started doing video when I was 12, volunteering at a church, doing kind of their like live AV type stuff. So like live, oddly enough, is kind of my origins in video, and that's how I got into stuff. So that was the input of what has become my career. And so if you don't get the sense from my content, maybe it's pretty obvious, but I'm like technically minded usually in like inputs, outputs, workflow efficiently, like signal flow. Like that's really important to me, making sure that, you know, everything's optimized along the way. I think that probably comes from those roots in live video, but then also like just the independent nature and like creative filmmaking of just trying to make content with as few means as possible. And so then doing the like feature films, like they're independent films, like again, not Hollywood productions or anything, just totally independent, kind of self-funded type stuff. And I don't know that they're good. Are they like cinematic masterclass type stuff? No, probably not. There's a lot that was a limitation of the technology, but then also a limitation of my skill sets at the time. And this was right at the time that Red User was just starting off. You know, Red 1, it was announced but not released. So they were taking pre-orders for this kind of vaporware camera at the time, is how Red was perceived anyway. That was their kind of stigma of like, oh, this thing will never come out. It's not really going to be that cheap. And, you know, nowadays you look at a Red and like, oh my God, they're so expensive. But at the time that was cheap, you know, film camera technology compared to everything else that was out. So it was that era, that time period. And so there was a lot of, I don't know, like hype, or just, it seemed like there was this bubble that was about ready to pop in terms of like filmmaking getting this like really big boost of energy. There's the same time that like Steven Soderbergh was doing some of his stuff with some of the, you know, more affordable cameras. I think one of his films was shot with an XL1, if I'm recalling correctly. And so just that kind of like independent filmmaker spirit hitting this tipping point where the technology was like almost there, but like the Red 1 wasn't out yet. And even when it came out, it was kind of buggy and kind of not quite perfect to what you would want. All the old camcorder stuff had all these big old accessories and attachments. Like the DVX100 recorded to mini DV tape, and the footage looks awful. Like it's just so much compression, and it's just alias. And you could like plug in Firewire to the DVX100 and you could record directly, like do a log and capture in Final Cut. So if you had a laptop with a Firewire to the DVX100, you'd get better signal. Even that, it was like standard def, but it was like really clean, good looking standard def instead of like compressed mini DV standard def, which just looks like trash. So all these like really weird contraptions and accessories to sort of like make it work. And then a couple years later, the 5D Mark II comes out, and that I think is why that camera was what it was, not because of the technology of the camera, but because of the time and all the lead up to it. You had all these people being really excited to make content with like these really kind of bootstrapped like contraptions, and then all of a sudden there's a camera that's $3,000, $3,500. I don't remember the initial list price of the 5D Mark II, but it comes out and it's everything you want in this tiny little form factor, and it does the shallow depth of field, the low light, like you can record to SD cards. Or maybe it was it compact flash on the 5D Mark II? Probably. They were CF cards, I believe. But that whole start of things, I think, there was this huge pressure building up, and then you finally had a camera that released the pressure, and so then it just like took off. And around the same time that YouTube was becoming more than just cat and dog videos and silly like America's Funniest Home Videos, right? It was what YouTube kind of began as, and then transitioning into more of this like creator community of people making short films and music videos and all sorts of stuff. That time was really cool to be operating at, like I've said this before, but like I've never shot with film, like traditional film, like film emulsion. Like I haven't, because I've never had the need to. Everything was like, okay, using the small budgets and the resources we had. And then by the time it was like, hey, let's start doing this stuff, it's like, all right, well, we're working with some really harsh restrictions. Then the 5D Mark II comes off, and it's like off to the races. The GH1, you've got the 7D, and then everything from there, and to where we are now, which is now, I mean, I can't even, like, people shoot on film for the fun and the nostalgia of it, but I don't personally have that because I never had to do it before. And I love the way digital video has evolved so much, and seeing that progression from, 4 minutes on 4 gigs on a P2 card that cost at least $1,000, $1,000 for 4 gigabytes. I mean, think about that, how insane that is. And having to have multiple of these so you could keep swapping and, transferring them on the fly. So like you had to have that function. Most of the time nowadays, people are able to shoot on a card. They have a couple cards, they dump at the end of the day. Like, no, we literally had to dump footage as we were shooting and wipe cards on set like day of because we didn't have the media. I think we had 5 P2 cards. So it's $5,000 just for media to be hot swapping like that and erasing them on the fly. And you hope that that person copies the cards and you don't lose shots, and everything's backed up and saved. So it's like, it was like just everything about it was really kind of, duct taped together. But that's also a situation where you learn a lot when you're put through that stress. And it's not just like the easy where everything's kind of done for you and you just show up and you just, operate the camera and you leave. No, everything was like super hands-on and figuring it out and troubleshooting and problem solving on the fly. Will I ever shoot a feature again? I would like to one day, but my interests are far more in television production, or at least serial, like series type content. I think there's value in a 2-hour story, but I think there's far more value in episodic. Things like Breaking Bad prove this. Game of Thrones, very fantastic, especially when you're adapting a book or a book series. Even some of the stuff that gets squeezed into movies, and it's like the book was so much better, and it's like, why is that? It's like you don't have time for the characters to live and breathe in a 2-hour film. And I don't know that I think that's cool, and for the people that do it, it's incredible. But I much more prefer the kind of organic, independent storytelling that maybe isn't deserving of like a feature film budget or attention, but I would want to put those energy and that resources into something that was more of like an episodic thing, probably. But like high-end storytelling, I could definitely see that happening. Back in the chat, another movie that was overlooked back in the day was a film called Nothing. They did so much for no budget. I believe it was the same director that did the movie called Cube. So I've heard good things about Cube. I don't know if I've actually seen it. I may have seen the sequel, like Hypercube. I think that's the sequel. But yeah, Cube is supposed to be really good. I haven't heard of Nothing, so I'll check that out. But yeah, I love that, like someone doing something. And that's usually like when you think of like the best movies, they're usually not the most expensive ones. They're not the ones with the most famous actors and the highest level directors and producers. It's usually, for me personally anyway, the films that I gravitate towards are those independent gems. Maybe they're kind of overlooked, or like the underdog, or they do well at a festival and they come out and then everyone loves them, or the kind of cult classic type stuff. But there's just so much originality there and creativity when you don't have the restrictions of the Hollywood, structure and system of, oh, well, that won't sell, because it doesn't follow like this set of rules, or, well, that doesn't make sense. You think of somebody like Tarantino, who has a lot of liberty, but that's because he started like basically just doing it himself. I mean, Reservoir Dogs is one of those classic, iconic, like, oh yeah, independent film, and obviously like was expensive. It's not like you could just do it for no budget, but he has a lot of liberty. You also have Christopher Nolan, who has proven himself time and time again of delivering like really compelling original content. But his first film following, I don't know if that's, he maybe did a short film before that. I think, I've actually seen it. I forget what it's called, but it's about like this, I think it's like a guy shrinks down or something. It's kind of weird. But Following is really interesting. Christopher Nolan's first feature film that I'm aware of, and then proving yourself over the long run. And that's really what it's about, like doing the best you can with what you have. And then that's what I was talking about with, the opportunity right now, is that if you do that, that one thing might not be the final thing, but it's the first step to get you there. And so that encouragement to just do something and put your kind of all into it, not necessarily financially, right? I wouldn't want someone to go broke making a film and then they can't feed themselves or feed their family, but putting your all into it, meaning doing your best, trying your hardest, being passionate about it and not just phoning it in can be very rewarding long term, because then just you put out content that you're capable of producing, and when people see that and they go, oh my god, you did that by yourself or with nothing, yeah, let's give you a little bit more. And then it's not the burden or the risk of giving somebody millions of dollars and then they blow it all on some terrible story and some terrible movie that's awful. Maybe they give you a couple million and you're able to do something incredible. Back in the chat, wow, you're bringing back with that HVX. I shot a short with the DVX100 back in the day, thinking it was crazy that it was flagging the frames to get true 24p. Yeah, DVX100. That was the thing with that camera, 24p. Yo, the XL1 was cool, but then, oh, the DVX100 does true 24p, so what now, Canon? And it's like that Canon, Panasonic back and forth, and you still see that to this day. We know manufacturers are chasing bit depth and resolution, but what do you think they could be chasing but aren't that would transform the shooting experience? We've got to figure out a way to manage data better. When you look at resolution, RAW, all these like codecs and the higher bit rates and like the quality that people want for the flexibility, like RAW is incredible, but it just takes up so much space. And we don't have hard drives yet. Yes, they're bigger, and we have 16, 20 terabyte hard drives, but the way that can just get bogged down if you're shooting 4K 120 RAW, like you'll just tear through a whole hard drive for like one tiny little project. So we have to get better at data management through probably they've talked about like holographic. I think that's how they refer to it, or like quantum computing, and then like holographic like disk storage or like fiber optic disk storage, or some form of storing data to where like it just takes off and this skyrockets. We're kind of hitting this diminishing returns where you're like, okay, I've got a 20 terabyte hard drive. Well, now I have a 24 terabyte hard drive, but that like 4 terabytes, it's kind of insignificant when you shoot 4 terabytes in an afternoon with these kind of new cameras that we're right on the cusp of getting. So having basically a system where you're not worried about the hard drive, the media, right? Like in a situation where it's basically infinite, or you don't have to worry about it that much, I think that opens up some really interesting opportunities in resolution, in your codec, and if you're able to capture RAW, as well as the opportunity for some of the stuff that Lytro was doing. I think they're still doing it. I'd imagine they're still working on it, or maybe Google or Apple bought them. But the light field technology, where you have multiple sensors, multiple lenses capturing an array of data about a scene, and then depth, and you can do some fun stuff there. That probably in its current state isn't all that helpful, but I imagine technology like that eventually, when you don't have the limitation of a hard drive and saying, well, I can only fit this much data, there's only so much you can do with that. I feel like we're kind of right at that even point where now that these cameras like the R5, it's like 8K RAW, and everyone's basically saying like, well, I probably wouldn't really ever shoot that just because it's so overkill. The mentality of that comes from the hard drive limitation and not having space for it. If you had space for it, you could justify, oh, it's 8K RAW, it's beautiful, it's gorgeous, it's easy to manipulate, as long as the camera doesn't overheat, which with the current situation, that's what we have. But eventually, a year, 2, 3 years from now, when that's a little bit more doable. Even Red, for the longest time, I mean, they have RAW and they have compressed RAW and Blackmagic. Everyone's compressing RAW, but it's still gigantic files. I mean, you have RAW photography that's been around forever, and like those files are significantly bigger than JPEG, and they're higher resolution. So when we put that over into video, and it's like now it's multiplied by a factor of 24 frames every second, or 60 frames a second, or 120 frames of raw 45 megapixel data, which in 8K, I don't know what the megapixel count is for 8K, but this just insane amounts of data. We have to get better at the way we process and store that, just for our own peace of mind, because I think people want this type of stuff, but then it's the burden on their wallet, and now you've got a whole server room in your house just to edit some YouTube videos. It's like, it's at that breaking point where I know me personally, and I know probably a lot of other people are like, yeah, like I'll take the H.264 version, or like I don't need the 8K or 6K, although the 4K is fine, just because it's overkill. because we don't have hard drives that can store it. So aside from that, any other technology that could be implemented? I mean, the VR 360 stuff is interesting, but even the consumption of that content is so low and insignificant. At this point, it's like, which way is that going to go? Is it going to go the route of 3D TVs, where it's kind of a gimmick? I think VR and AR will get better. At what rate and like how much do people adopt that technology will dictate how much content gets produced there. It's probably gonna be that chicken or egg situation, you know. So far, I don't think there's been kind of the like killer app on the content side. So I think it is much more of a hardware restriction and limitation when you have things like, you know, the wires dangling off and some of the first generation type stuff, and then the fact that you have to put this thing on and it totally blocks you off from the real world, and it's very isolated. You know, it's not something you can easily do with the people around you. There's all these inherent limitations to it. Maybe AR takes off in a more meaningful way than VR has, but I think there's potential there. It's just having the right hardware on the consumer side so you can consume the content in a meaningful way will make it a little bit easier to justify producing the content in a meaningful way. Because right now there's some VR cameras and they're all kind of cool, but they're definitely not the high quality, high caliber that when you're looking at footage on the internet of like the A7S III and you're like, oh my gosh, that's beautiful. I've never seen VR footage that's beautiful or breathtaking. It's usually like, oh, that's cool, that's neat. It's kind of like this tech demo, but nothing that's made me feel like, oh my gosh, I'm here, you know. And that would probably take upwards of probably 16K, 32K, like I don't know how many Ks of resolution. You're probably talking about like 100 megapixels of data at least to make a convincing reality space. And then again, doing that in real time or faster than real time, right? Because real life isn't at 24 frames. 24 frames just kind of looks nice as cinema, but real life, you know, having a high frame rate but motion blur captured to mimic, you know, this, I'm imagining this virtual sphere of like footage that's captured with an array of cameras. So you have depth now, you've got 3D, like that's an insane amount of data. And so we have to have a better way to store it. So again, I think it's always on that limitation of like the hard drives, the media cards, like the way we're storing data. We're kind of at this, again, this pressure has been building where we have the technology and the capability to produce crazy amounts of data, but we don't have a good way to store it. Once that gets solved, I think you're going to see maybe another explosion of opportunity and potential to make new types of experiences that we just don't currently do, because it would just be ridiculous to even think of that, right? Think of the highest resolution. Like if you had, you know, stereoscopic R5 rigs, so you're shooting 3D, but then you're shooting 6 different ways. Now you've got 12 cameras at least to do, you know, and I don't know that you technically have to do that, but I'm just saying like this is the kind of a crazy, you could probably do 3D without that. I think, no, you probably do need stereoscopic. In any case, let's imagine you need 12 Canon R5s that don't overheat and you shoot 8K RAW. Now, so you do 8K, whatever those storage rates are, and then multiply by a factor of 12, and then do that for any duration that's meaningful or a meaningful experience that can be consumed passively again. Now, if you want to, now do we do light field technology with Lytro where you can actually move around in this space? Now we're terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of data streaming on the fly. Like that's just not something that's feasible right now, but that would be a really cool experience to put on a headset. And it's not a video game, but it's real footage of real life, but it feels like you're there because it's 3D, because you can kind of move around a little bit. I think that'd be a very, very captivating experience. And also the headset would have to have a screen in it that is like, you know, retina display levels of resolution, to where, you know, these screens that are right up next to your eyeballs are just, you can't even see the pixels, because that's the other limitation with VR, is that you can kind of see the screen a little bit. The moment all that goes away and you can just immerse yourself in like, whoa, I feel like I'm actually here, that'll be really cool, I imagine. We'll get there eventually. I'm gonna pop over and do the last video I had planned, which is talking about the 180-degree shutter rule. I think there's a little bit of a misconception about the 180-degree rule, as I see people leave this comment on some of my videos and people talk about this online, and people talk about it on set. The 180-degree rule typically a lot of times gets applied to your shutter speed and how a lot of people talk about it, which if you look up 180-degree shutter angle, this is a thing. This is important. In fact, these are some of the videos I've done on the topic that people seem to enjoy. There's also some charts here that you can look at explaining 180-degree shutter angle. There's even a Wikipedia page. There's some videos. Hey, there's one of mine. Shutter angle explained. You can go watch that. This is an older one, but still, I think, valuable. I think a lot of cameras should have shutter angle built in. The GH5 does. Film cinema cameras do. The S1H does, but Sony seems to not think it's all that important for the A7S III, which I really wish it were included, but shutter angle is apparently not a feature at release on the A7S III. But 180-degree shutter angle isn't the 180-degree rule. People like to say or think that it is, maybe because it's very easy to get confused about it, because there is a 180-degree rule. But the 180-degree rule is something different. The 180-degree rule is for shooting and making sure that you're always on the right side for when you're cutting content together. So if you went to film school, this should be taught in most classes, but I think on the internet and in videos, it can get confusing because people always talk about 180-degree shutter angle being really, really important. I'm one of those people. I think it is very important, making sure that you're basically shooting with a 180-degree shutter as you're changing your frame rate is important to make sure that you have good motion blur and that it's pleasing to look at. But the 180-degree rule is about your subjects and where your actors are. So there is no rule for the shutter angle. It's not a rule that you have to use 180-degree shutter angle. It's not a rule. You can break it if you want. There's good reason to break it. Shoot with a 90-degree shutter angle. Shoot with a 360-degree shutter angle. You can break that rule all you want. The 180-degree rule is much more of an important rule. It can be broken intentionally, but you should only break it intentionally. If you break it unintentionally, your footage is going to look really weird when you cut it together. So basically, you always want to stay on a 180-degree arc side of your actors or your subject, because if you switch to go to the other side of that arc, to the other opposite 180-degree, now you get an inverse of what you're filming, which kind of throws everything out of perspective when you're cutting different scenes around. Actors and objects are changing orientation because you broke the 180-degree rule. And if you've ever seen this happen, it is rather jarring if you watch some films do it accidentally, where an actor will basically pop up in the same spot as the previous actor because they didn't follow the 180-degree rule, and both actors are on the same side of the frame, but they're talking to each other. You want back and forth, right, between your actors, so that like one's on this side, and then you cut to the next shot, and they're on and the other actor's on this side, and it looks like they're looking at each other through the way your brain processes information. If you don't do that, they just pop up on the same side, and it looks like they're both looking the same direction at the same thing, but they're talking to each other. It's very disorienting. So it is a rule for good reason. It provides continuity and consistency with perspective so that you're not confusing your audience. So that's why it's a rule, and it's really important. But it has nothing to do with shutter angle, even though that also should be 180 degrees. And in general, it's good to treat it as if it is a rule, but it's not a rule that you can't break. And that's why I wanted to make this video, just to talk through this stuff, because they're easily interchangeable in the way people talk, because people use shorthand and, oh, are you following the 180-degree rule with your shutter? You're like, well, yeah, sure, I am. But like, also we need to make sure we're following the real 180-degree rule about where we're filming from, so we're not on opposite sides shooting at each other, getting weird opposing shots. It just throws your whole perspective out of place. So I don't know that there's a better way to talk about it, because they're both 180-degree angle, and shutter angle should be more adopted and embraced. There's still people to this day who are discovering it for the first time going, oh my gosh, this is the best thing ever, because shutter speed is different. Shutter angle is what you want if you're making video or film or any kind of cinematography. Shutter speed is a photography thing, and people have adapted shutter speed rules to mimic the 180-degree shutter angle, but it's just nice when it's built right into the camera. So again, cameras like the GH5, the S1H, the Blackmagic cameras that are cinema cameras, most higher end cameras will allow you to 180 degree shutter angle. But there's quite a few hybrid photography cameras that don't have shutter angle as a feature, in which case I think that's where people get tripped up. They start learning about shutter angle and 180 degrees. So you mean 180th shutter speed? It's like, no, that's not 180 degree shutter angle. Like shutter speed, like 1 over 180 is not the same as 180 degrees. It technically would be if you were shooting 90 frames a second, but that's where it gets into all the math and all the breakdown, and you're basically multiplying by a half. 1 over your frame rate times 1 over your half gives you your shutter speed equivalent of what 180 degree would be. And the reason that is because 180 is half of 360. A lot of math involved. Hopefully you know this stuff. If you don't, definitely look it up so you can understand it a little bit better. But no, this is the real 180 degree rule, and it has nothing to do with shutter speed or shutter angle for that matter. Can pop back into the chat. We know manufacturers are chasing bit depth and resolution. I read that one already. I remember the splash the 5D Mark II made. If it basically gave birth to DSLR video. Oh yeah. I mean, the 5D Mark II was revolutionary at the time. The biggest disappointment of all of it is that Canon didn't embrace it, and they saved all of those features and that functionality for their high-end cinema cameras that are significantly more expensive, basically betraying everybody who bought the 5D Mark II for video from my perspective. I mean, betraying is a strong word, but that's kind of the perception, right? You release a camera that has these amazing video features, and then you go, whoops, well, let's just keep doing that on our photography cameras, and then like let's make this cinema line of, you know, cameras that are much more expensive so that like we don't cannibalize ourselves in like the cinema market. It's like, if people want the high-end cinema cameras, I suppose they're going to buy them. I don't know that it makes a difference if you put high-end features in a hybrid, because some people just don't want a hybrid. They want a cinema camera, like the form factor and everything about it. I personally prefer the hybrid style of shooting just because it's so convenient. But you know, that's why I'm not a hugest Canon fan, because they seem to keep just screwing themselves over for honestly no reason, and letting every other company just eat their lunch. Sony specifically right now, the A7S III looks incredible. Like that, it looks incredible, that camera. The more I read and learn about what Canon is doing with the R5 and the R6, and the more I see what Sony did with the A7S III and actually improving in meaningful, substantial ways, finally, after all this time, they've like fixed all the issues, and they've improved, they've added features, and they did everything that Canon was trying to do, but Canon just overheats, and it makes it, apparently, again, and this is from the reviews and the stuff you see online, because I haven't actually tested these cameras myself, but people say that like the Canon footage is really hard to edit, and it's slow. So even if it's not the overheating, it's the files are kind of clunky, and there's no good way to edit the stuff. Meanwhile, the Sony files seem to edit just fine, and it doesn't overheat, and the files aren't insanely like huge, massive files. I know there's some, you know, smaller file sizes on the R5 and R6 as well, but the autofocus seems to be on point for the A7S III. Color, you've got 422 10-bit, like everything you would want. It's not going to crop, and not that the R5 and the R6 are either, but it's just all the stuff that has become so like the norm on like the hybrid style cameras, like from Canon, of like, yeah, I can do video, but it's a crop, or yeah, I can do it, but it's only 24, or oh yeah, I can do it, but autofocus doesn't work in that mode, or whatever. It's like all that's gone away for both systems, to be, you know, honest about it. But then Canon just like botched it to where it like overheats. And granted, it's a much larger sensor. I mean, you're talking about 45 megapixels compared to 12 megapixels. I mean, that's a substantial difference in terms of data and processing. So it's no wonder the thing overheats. But was the smarter choice just to go with the 12 megapixel? Like, we'll see. I don't know. Like, will we see? Who's going to sell more cameras? Are more people going to buy the R5 or the R6, or are they going to buy the A7S III? I have a feeling more people are going to buy the A7S III, because if you just want a photography camera, you either probably already have that, or you would maybe buy a slightly older version, where like oh yeah, now that the Canon R and the RP will maybe see a price drop. Maybe they're already down in price. I haven't checked them, but like that's kind of now, the older, the first gen. Now we have the R5 and the R6 that are flashy and new. It's like if you just need photos, like there are cameras for that. And granted, the R5 is a solid photography camera. The autofocus looks incredible, but I imagine a lot of people who are like I take photos. I have a camera for that. I'm a photographer, so like I don't necessarily need it. But if I do, sure, like I'll buy the new one. Where there are, from my perspective, many more people who want a true hybrid that can do both photo and video reliably, and they don't care that it's 12 megapixels, because people have been talking about megapixels for the longest time, of like, you don't actually need 45, you don't need 50, you don't need these crazy amounts. For most things, you can get by with far less. And looking at it and going, well, if that's the one thing, that I have 12 megapixels and you have 45, but my camera works all the time and I can do all the things, and yeah, it doesn't have 8K, but like no one's shooting 8K anyway, I think a lot of people are going to buy the A7S III. At least that's where I'd put my money. Back in the chat. I can fit 4 hours of 4K onto 4 gigabytes now. yeah. No, back in the day it was 4 minutes. And I don't know if you're 4 hours of 4K onto 4 gigabytes now. Yeah, that's some heavy compression. You get about, it's like a minute of 4K on most cameras is about a gigabyte. But like gigabytes don't even matter anymore because you have terabytes. But yeah, it was funny back in the day. 4 gigabytes was $1,000. At least I'm pretty sure it was around there. It fluctuated because they were different size cards. But they were proprietary, so it was it is what it was, and you had to buy it directly from Panasonic. And yeah, only 4 minutes of like sub HD, or like 1080i, basically what it was. It sounds like you think filmmaking is going to go very tech as opposed to more analog. It's so odd to consider when you think about how much directors used to fight against tech. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, what would the difference be there that you draw between tech and analog? I don't think practically you're going to have some people who shoot on film, sure, as kind of like a hipster, cool, quirky thing to do. Oh, this film was shot on film, 30 years from now, when that's like not a thing people do. Like you start to see that now where, what was it, The Lighthouse, or these movies are like, oh, it's 4:3 and it's black and white. No, it's, so retro. I think that's few and far between. I think most people are very comfortable with digital nowadays, especially because the technology is there as far as dynamic range and resolution, and all the stuff that Red was claiming 10 years ago has come true. And part of it is because they made it come true, and also just other companies have embraced the technology and added video to photography cameras and made cinema cameras that are $4,000, when we're looking at stuff like the Z-Cam. So I think the tech of it could be, an avenue to explore. I don't know what the adoption is going to be of it. I don't think you're going to have traditional movies and TV go away, though. We still have books to this day, right? Even though they invented the TV long ago, people still write books, people still read books. Reading is very analog. Writing is very analog. But we can do it on a Kindle now, or we can do it on an iPad. And so there's some of that adaptation that's happening, but people are still writing and reading, even though we have visual mediums. Aside from, like the 3D virtual kind of thing, are they going to add like smell-o-vision? Like that's something that's been joked about for a long time. I think they tried. There was some movie way back when they did as like kind of like a gimmick. They had a scratch and sniff thing that came with it, or maybe there was a theater that like pumped in weird smells as like a test thing. I don't think people really want that all that much. I think it's a little weird to smell like gunpowder, during a war scene in a film. Like it's unnecessary. I don't need it. It doesn't immerse me more. In fact, it takes me out of it because now I smell and I go, wait, is something actually burning in here? It's like film for me and storytelling is about immersion and pulling someone into the experience, not necessarily like throwing more stuff at them to like make them immersed. Like you get some of the the seats that vibrate and like do all sorts of weird stuff, or they splash water at you when it's like the ocean scene, and like that gimmicky type of stuff. pulls me out of it every time. I think that's why most people don't like it. But when you're talking about immersion, and you can literally put on a headset and now you're immersed in a brand new space and you can look around, and I'm talking about a situation where it looks indistinguishable from real life because it was captured with so much data up front that it would be like, in the same way that like 4K or 8K, if you watch it on the right display, it looks so clear that there is a reality to it because it is actual real life captured in such a high fidelity. You do that in a virtual space with stereoscopic 3D. Now it feels like you're actually there with screens that are imperceptible to your eye. That is an experience based on tech that is immersive because it literally brings you into it. And I find that it could be potentially a really interesting future. For me, I'm still surprised how little things progress, or how little progress has been made in battery technology. The shooting schedule revolves around battery life. Imagine going on a 2-week documentary trip with one battery. For me, the battery thing is less of an issue because they're relatively cheap and you can have a couple of them. It is annoying to have to switch batteries, but we do have to charge our phones, and maybe that's also in line with what you're talking about. Imagine just going 2 weeks without having to charge your phone. Yeah, that would be great, but you're still going to have to charge it in 2 weeks. So I think as long as it kind of makes it through the day and you just charge it every night, that's sufficient for most people because it just becomes part of the habit, part of the routine. If cameras could do something similar where you could shoot an entire day on a charge and then you just recharge it at the end of the day, I think that would be interesting, but our batteries definitely aren't there yet. So I think they are doing some development in battery tech though, so we'll see if that takes off in any meaningful way over the next couple of years. Is it like graphite batteries or graphene batteries? One of those. Graphene, graphite. I think they're trying to do some graphene batteries. We could look it up because I find it interesting. Graphene, is that how you spell it, or is it with an E? Oh, it's with an E. Just looking. So here's a video. Graphene batteries, what are they and why are they a big deal? Yeah, graphene batteries, supposedly going to be a lot better. But is it happening? Is it happening anytime soon? Graphene batteries would allow smartphones to be thinner or offer more battery capacity while keeping their current proportions. There are also interesting implications for fast device-to-device charging, with batteries able to support very high currents and blazing fast recharge and discharge times. Gadgets could charge each other up at super fast speeds. That's interesting. Although graphene battery technology remains some years away, it's a tantalizing prospect for future smartphones. Yes. Sounds interesting. Would be interesting to see how that develops, or if there's some other polymer battery technology type thing that's coming. In the chat, Blackmagic Pocket Cam 6K, same price, and saves in ProRes. Yes, it does. The Pocket Cinema camera comes with those limitations that are with the Pocket Cinema camera, with the battery life not being that great, and the 6K version having the EF mount, so you don't have a mirrorless mount, so you have less options in terms of adapters. But yeah, the Pocket Cinema camera 6K is fantastic. Same price as what? I mean, the Pocket Cinema 6K is, I think, $2,000, but that 6K isn't high frame rate, so you're going to be, I think you have to do 4K. I think you do 4K 60, but your 6K is going to be 24 or 30, I believe, if I'm correct on it. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm wrong. Let me look it up. Have the computer right here. Take a look. Pocket Cinema camera 6K. Let's see. Let's go to B&H, just because the specs usually they give you a nice way to look at it. Yeah, so to $2,000, you have a Super 35 sensor. Oh, you can do 6K up to 50 frames per second. So I wonder, yeah, so you have some slow-mo option there. These cameras are really, really cool, and I like the screen on them. It's giant and really nice to look at. It's unfortunate that it doesn't flip, but it is cool that it comes with the screen built in, so you're not in the situation of the Z-Cam where you have to have the external recorder or external display to monitor it. I mean, Blackmagic just makes such great products. I can't speak highly enough of them. The Ursa Mini Pro, fantastic camera, built-in NDs, does everything you would want. The Pocket Cinema camera, slight little alternative version. You don't have the built-in NDs, but you can basically do everything else for $2,000. Like that's a incredible deal. And it's a good point in the chat saying that it records ProRes, because that is really, really valuable. ProRes is such a great codec. Having it right, just straight into editing, and you don't have to make proxy files, is fantastic. Back in the chat, and what about Panasonic S1H with a Ninja 5 for raw 6K? Yes, S1H also really cool. That one I know does not do high frame rate at 6K, so that is a limitation there, and it's only going to do 4K 60 compared to like the A7S, which will do 4K 120, which I find I like the benefits that come with that, especially when then you can do 1080 at 240. Opens up a lot of possibilities creatively the slower you can go. And then the 1080 is a reduction in limitation, but there's a lot of people who shoot 1080 and they upscale to 4K still, and most people don't. Regular viewers I'm talking about, maybe the pixel peepers and maybe the industry professionals notice, but when the GoPro Hero 2 came out, that was making it into feature films as like a crash camera. Same thing with the 5D Mark II and the Mark III. They just put it in the weird spots, and you'd be watching a show, and then there's obviously the kind of small little camera they put in the interesting spot. I think they used, was it the 5D Mark II or Mark III that they used on Breaking Bad? I'm pretty sure they used one of those for some of those kind of specialty shots where they put the cameras in weird places. And with proper color grading and workflow and in the hands of professionals, looks pretty good. So the limitation is not the technology. The limitation is the creativity and the thought and intent behind the content, the storytelling typically. How do you keep someone engaged? How do you tell a compelling story? And then just doing it with the best technology you have available at the time. I think the A7S III is going to outsell the R5 by a lot. It's just a more practical camera for shooting video. I agree. We'll see, I guess. But I got to imagine the overheating issues on the R5 and the R6 have just turned so many people off from those cameras that would have happily bought. Because when you look at the lens lineup, the RF lenses, like Canon makes great lenses. The 24-70 that they have, the 2.8, is stabilized, where I don't believe the Sony one is. So Sony has a 24-70 that's not stabilized. I just feel like the RF lenses are just like better selection, better quality, they look nicer. Everything about Canon design visually and aesthetically I think is very, very nice, but if the camera is a toaster, it's not helpful. I have the Pocket 4K, love the image, eats the LPE6 battery like Pez. Yeah, and you can do external power for the Pocket Cinema cameras, both the 4K and the 6K, but then now you have the accessory problem that we were talking about earlier with the back in the days of the HVX. Like, I don't want to go back to that stuff. I want to intentionally, there's a camera that needs to be built out a specific way, then great, fine. It's by design that it's supposed to be big and bulky, and that's a benefit in a lot of ways, because if you have a bigger camera, it's going to be a little bit more stable. Your camera movements are a little bit better when you have something that's bigger and heavier. But if you have something that's meant to be small, and like the Pocket Cinema camera, my expectation is that I don't have an SSD hanging off on one side and a battery hanging off on the other, or that I have to be plugged into direct power or some fanny pack battery contraption where I'm plugging in constantly. Like, that's not what I want from that type of camera. If it's a Pocket Cinema camera, I want it to be relatively pocketable, at least in some measure. And it's a video camera. I mean, it's definitely not a photography camera, so it should be able to last a little bit longer than like 30 minutes, which I think is probably the average for what you'd get out of one of those LPE6 batteries. Back in the chat, someone says, good morning. If it's morning where you're at, well, I'm about to say good night because it's night where I'm at. But good morning. Any tips on filmmaking to a music video without the musicians? Thanks. Filmmaking to a music video without the musicians. I mean, so much of music videos is just about the music. Like, when you look at the view counts, especially online on YouTube, like, people are listening to them multiple times on repeat for the music. Now, is the visual component valuable? Yeah, I think it is. I think you can do some fun stuff. I look at music videos as a way to do all the tech demo type stuff that's really interesting or cool or kind of quirky. So if you have something you want to try as like an experiment, and it doesn't have to make linear sense in terms of like storytelling or anything, it's just like experimental type stuff, more of like the artsy type stuff. But I would use it, you know, to your advantage if there's some kind of like technology, whether it's I think of one of the fun ones that always comes to mind. Matt and Kim did the band Matt and Kim did a video, I think it's Let's Go, where I believe they put a GoPro on a hanger and they spun it around themselves. Okay, and then did super slow-mo, so then they throw dollar bills in the air and they throw glitter and they throw stuff in the air. So you're getting that like slow-mo orbit or like through all this stuff. Is it the highest quality video? No, but is it really neat and interesting to look at? Yes. Does it make you wonder, how did they do that? And then you see, oh, it was a coat hanger and fishing line. That's really cool. Now, you can get the same effect now with some of the 360 cameras, but that technology or that effect, I think, comes from the fact that people are doing that type of stuff, and then putting it in a music video is really cool and makes you go, wow, I like the song and I like the execution, rather than, and did that have to be the actual musicians in that case? No, it could have been anybody spinning that stuff. It makes sense that it was them, but it doesn't have to be the musicians. I would look at it as a way to be kind of artsy, kind of experimental, test things out that you haven't done before, maybe like hyperlapse type stuff or 360 type stuff. Maybe if there's some cool, like, who else does those really great music videos? Or back in the day, the White Stripes did a bunch of them. Who is the filmmaker they worked with? I'm sure someone knows. Where it was like the kind of optical distortion, illusion type stuff, but in camera. So almost the same effects you would get for like the Hobbit films or Lord of the Rings, where making people look small or making people look big just by the shape of the room and the objects they're interacting with and how you're filming it. Forced perspective type stuff. Doing that in a music video, I think, is really fun because it doesn't necessarily have to make sense of why it's happening. Maybe there is a good reason that relates to the song, but you get to try and experiment with things. Maybe you can do some super slow-mo stuff with, you know, liquids and splatters. I mean, you look at Steve Geralt, I don't know how you say his last name, who I'm sure most of you should be familiar with, and he does a lot of the motion-controlled slow-mo commercial type work. You know, if maybe you're not doing commercial type work, but you think that that's really cool and that's really interesting, incorporate some of those techniques into your music video, and that's another thing you wouldn't necessarily need the musicians for. Could you include them? Yeah, I'm sure there's some slow-mo, cool, motion-controlled stuff you could do in that same way. And especially now that, you know, cameras, you can rent them relatively affordably for a music video, or some of the new ones, you know, they'll shoot 240. I mean, that's pretty slow, and you can do a lot with that. Is it phantom speeds? No. But if you need the phantom, you know, thousands of frames per second, you can do that too. So I'd say just use it as like a fun way to experiment, both creatively and technically, using the tools you have and trying things you haven't necessarily done before. Super low light type stuff. You know, what can you do in the darkness, where like, and then how do you capture that creatively with like something like the A7S III when that comes out, or even some like the A7S II that's already out, if you have some urgency to do it right now. In the chat, Peter Gregg says, awesome streaming, Strons, thumbs up, and good to see you. Thanks for joining the stream. I'm gonna try and do these as frequently as I can. And then Peter Gregg, suddenly I feel all warm and fuzzy. That was subvids. And then Trevor says, Peter Gregg is one of the best for sure. Yes, absolutely. Tangent, have you tried editing on a tablet yet? I just got an iPad Pro and can edit the S1H H265 6K video like nothing. It's insane. My iMac struggles with it. I haven't done that. Who just did a video on editing on an iPad? It's popped up in my feed either today or yesterday about, what was it? Let me see if I can find the video. Maybe we'll take a look at it. Was it Max? Did Max do the video? Yeah, here we go. How to easily edit R5 4K and 8K video and why it's tough. So in the thumbnail, you can see he's holding up the iPad and what looks like, is that Final Cut X? I assume Final Cut X runs on. I don't actually use Final Cut X, so I don't actually know. But I saw this thumbnail. I thought it was interesting. Of okay, maybe is there something special about the way iPads work that makes them more efficient in handling these types of codecs? So let's see.
Really helpful tips on how to make the EOS R5's 4K and 8K footage much easier to edit. I'm also going to explain why my computers, my high-end computers, even the $15,000 Mac Pro had such a hard time editing that. And we are going to be taking a look at editing some of that footage on the iPad Pro, which is going to be very interesting. First thing I want to talk about is...
Sounds like the way to do it is with the iPad Pro. I haven't actually tested that myself yet. I can't imagine it being fun editing on an iPad, but theoretically, yeah, I guess you hook up a mouse and keyboard and go to town. I don't have the need to do that just yet. I'm not at the point where I need to go buy an iPad Pro to do editing. My MacBook handles GH5 footage just fine, handles Ursa Mini ProRes footage just fine. We'll see what future cameras hold and what that workflow ends up adapting to. But I think that if the only way to edit footage is by getting an iPad Pro, I think we have a bigger problem at hand that probably needs to be addressed. Let's see, LumaFusion Pro. Is that another video I need to look up? LumaFusion Pro. How to edit video on an iPad.
About a week ago, I did a video where I talked about my mobile editing process for both
Let me know
video
how this
and still
sounds, because the way I have the audio
iPad,
hooked
and I had
up
an
isn't
enormous
quite
amount of
perfect. I
requests
probably
to
should
do
have
something
headphones
on
on.
LumaFusion. LumaFusion
But just let
is
me know
the
how it
software that
sounds.
I use for editing video on an iPad. Thought about this and thought it might be kind of cool to take you through the whole process of what I do when I edit video. The first question people usually ask is, why would you want to edit video on your iPad? Well, because this is it. This is my entire computer setup. It's much smaller than this over here. It doesn't get hot. It's faster than my desktop setup. And so this has been just a huge game changer for me in the way I've been able to get productivity done this year when it comes to editing. And so I'm a big proponent of this.
I got to imagine editing on an iPad Pro would be good in some situations if it was a quick video with some light editing that needed to be done. But for some of the projects where I have layers of B-roll and there's a lot going on, a lot of footage on a hard drive, maybe it works. Maybe I have to watch more of this video and see if it really is a game changer. But I'm highly skeptical. I think in certain situations maybe it's interesting, but I don't know that I would across the board say, yeah, editing on an iPad Pro is the way to go. I'm skeptical, but I'll take a look. Thanks for pointing it out. Let's see, there's a slight echo, but it's fine. Yeah, it's the way I have the stream set up. I really should have headphones on, but then, I don't know, I feel like that looks kind of strange. Maybe I'll figure that out at some point, but hopefully it's fine or good enough for the time being for referencing little clips. You can kind of see, what it is, what it sounds like, and see if it's a video you want to go check out more of. iOS does not support ProRes. That's really funny. I've never thought about even handling ProRes footage with iOS, so I've never even considered that. But wow, fun fact. ProRes, the codec developed by Apple, not supported on iOS, also developed by Apple. Thanks, Trons. You've given some good ideas there. I have a GH4, G Pro 4, 5D2 as a GoPro 4, 5D2, also an A7 III, so a mixed bag, so not very low light stuff maybe. Interesting. That's a lot of varieties of cameras. I understand why it happens. I would be curious if there's ones you don't use that you should swap out, or why you have one versus the other. Oftentimes, I don't like having a variety of cameras that are very, very different, because it ends up matching all of that footage later even more of a nightmare. It's almost like I'd rather work with all one uniform system and take some cutbacks in some places, like, oh, it's not as good at photography or the autofocus isn't quite as good, but at least I'm standardized Some of the shoots that I'll do, there's multiple cameras rolling, so having to color grade all that to match, even between same cameras, just the differences between lenses is enough to make it a slight headache where you're doing different color on for different cameras because the lenses are different. So then to have the other layer of, oh, it's a totally different manufacturer, and you're mixing Canon and Sony and GoPro and GH4, GH5, Panasonic stuff, that is a nightmare in editing that I hate dealing with. For my own sanity, I want everything input as clean as possible and as uniform and as consistent as possible so that nothing is tarnished through color grading and theoretically ruining stuff because like the cameras don't match. You see it all the time, and it's one thing that immediately takes me out of content is when there's one camera that looks one way and then it cuts to another camera that looks very, very different. You immediately recognize, oh, I'm watching something, and it pulls you out of it. So having that hiccup in a final product is something I try and avoid basically whenever I can, and it's even at the front end acquisition point of trying to film as uniformly as possible. Are there situations where I have to use different cameras? Yes, it does happen, but I do not like it, and I would not choose to do it if I didn't have to. All right, looking back in the chat, that's something they can easily fix when they want. iOS supporting ProRes. Yeah, they should probably do that. The new iPad has ARM chips in it, and it will do better than even my full-size 27-inch iMac. Will cut through HEVC like a hot knife through butter. That's really good to know and interesting that and it makes sense, right? That like the H.265 stuff being more compressed, less designed for traditional editing, maybe more optimized for devices that are meant for higher compression or like uncompression, depression. I don't know what do you call it? Uncompress something. On the fly. So I can understand why that is the case. Is following a narrative not that important for a music video? I think it can be, but I don't think it's necessarily essential. I think there's many ways to work with it. If you have some beginning, middle, and end in mind, yeah, I think that's a good way to approach it, and it not just being just random. But at the same time, there is a lot of stuff that is just random, and I think that also works too, depending on the context, depending on the song. So you just have to use your judgment and probably the band, probably the track itself, and evaluating what you want to do. But I think it's relatively subjective, and I don't think you have to follow a narrative by any means. I think you could be much more artistic and free with it, to where it's just, if it's not the musician or it's just people dancing or whatever, like, that's definitely a valid way to make a music video. Many music videos exist like that. The new silicon chips are still coming in the Macs. Actually editing on an iPad, gosh, that is for road trips maybe. Yeah, I get that editing on an iPad would be something to do fun on the fly if you're doing YouTube videos or vlogs and you're mobile and it's just an easy way to cut something together. But I imagine for bigger projects, like I wouldn't want to be on my iPad. I can't imagine. But maybe not. I'm just skeptical, like I said. I'm not saying a hard no. It's just I'm resistant. It's just like the cloud editing stuff that they've been saying is coming. Oh, you can edit in the cloud, edit in the cloud. And it's like, in theory, this should work, but it never operates the way you exactly want it to. And so you end up just being like, okay, I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to do it old school. Catch you later. Time for bed. See you, Peter. Talk to you later. And Tony says, absolutely, it's a nightmare. I had to color match a Sony and 2 Canons, and even the Canons were different. Happens all the time. Surprisingly, maybe it's not obvious, but like lenses are very different in terms of color, even similar like made lenses from the same manufacturer. So that's why, like, if you get cinema lenses that are from a set, they're all supposed to be color matched. But oftentimes that's not how people are shooting. They're shooting with a Sigma lens and a Canon lens, or they're switching between things. Different lenses from Sigma, different lenses from Canon, and even on the same body, that's less of an issue to usually have to deal with, because usually your colors are interpreted kind of the same way. It's just maybe one shot's a little warmer from one camera or a little greener. Like the tint is kind of off, but like the contrast might be slightly different. But the Canons, the cameras themselves, if they're both Canon, should be interpreting colors the same, seeing things the same. Whereas that's not true from Canon to Sony to Panasonic, where those are all seeing colors very differently. And so then that input affects the output, and then you're at a situation where you're tearing your hair out trying to make it all match, and it's just not fun. In the chat, maybe I stick to one camera with different focal lengths. I would recommend that 100%. If you have the luxury of doing that, absolutely use one camera and switch up focal lengths. Now, it takes longer to capture that way because you can't be recording simultaneously, but usually that's how you get the best shots anyway, is having one intentional shot in mind with the camera getting that shot, and then getting another, intentional shot with a different focal length from a different angle. It's definitely my recommendation. Let's see. Editing on an iPad with the Apple Pencil is very easy and fast, not necessarily for everyone. I'll check it out, but I mean, how do you hook up the hard drive? You just plug it in to the lightning port there? I don't know what that workflow is. In the chat, Trevor, I have been waiting for them to do it since the original release of the iPad Pro. How long do we have to wait in terms of supporting ProRes? And then someone says, Strons, I just saw the title of the live stream. Maybe I can play about with the 180-degree rule sounds fun. So the one that comes to mind, there's a Lars von Trier movie called Antichrist, and I believe it's early on in that film. It's definitely a rough film. If you're, you have a sensitive, you're sensitive to content. It's not G-rated, right? But Antichrist by Lars von Trier, there's an early scene early on, if I'm recalling correctly. There's a hospital scene where stuff starts to happen, and the 180-degree rule is intentionally broken, if I'm remembering correctly. It's been a while since I've seen this film, probably almost 10 years. I don't remember when it came out. But I remember it being jarring, but intentionally jarring, and that's the thing. Knowing that, okay, this wasn't a mistake, this was done to disorient the viewer for a purpose, I think that's kind of fun. So if you have a reason to break a rule because you want to make a point to the viewer to like shock them out of something and to overwhelm them, the same thing is true of like jump cuts in films. Typically you need at least 3, kind of that rule of 3, to make it seem intentional. If there's just a random jump cut, it feels like it happened once upon a time in Hollywood. So Tarantino's latest film, there is the random jump cut in there where he gets the cowboy hat and then it's taken off. I assume this is some throwback to the way maybe this happened in some TV show or a movie a long time ago where someone just had a hat for some reason and then it disappeared. But when I saw that, it was the worst time for me because it was the moment like halfway through the film where I'm in the theater and I had to go to the restroom because I had drank the whole soda, that you get at the movie theater. And I come back and I sit down and all of a sudden jump cut, and I don't think it's Leonardo DiCaprio's character. I think it's what's his name? It's that guy from the Hitman movies, and he's from Justified. Forget his name. He gets a hat, he jump cut, and I'm immediately like, what is happening right now? What did I miss? And I was with some friends, and I was like, what's happening? And they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, what? Didn't you just see the jump cut? He just had a hat, and then it disappeared for no reason. Did that happen before? And they're like, no. I'm like, what? Does it have something to do with what's going on? And they're like, no. So it's like, it's not like I could process it normally, like just watching the film. I just come back and then all of a sudden there's like these jump cuts, and there's a cowboy hat that disappears and then disappears, and I'm like, what is happening right now in this film? I think it's kind of that like tongue-in-cheek kind of a joke done intentionally, but it was a really weird experience to be watching a film, like coming back and trying to figure out, okay, what did I miss? And then all of a sudden, because it never happens any other time in that film that I'm aware of where there's just a random jump cut and things, costumes or wardrobe changes. So a little startling. Back in the chat, if you know Apple, you know they won't do anything fast. That is true. iPad Pro is USB-C. Oh, is it? I wasn't aware that the iPad Pro is USB-C. I wish that hopefully they just do that across the board. The funniest thing about Apple is, for as consistent and as perfect and as intentional as their designs have been in the past, they are notorious for breaking their own rules and mucking it up for everybody else. They implemented Thunderbolt 3, USB-C, right? The port matches, so it's USB-C or Thunderbolt 3. That's great. That's fantastic. Excellent. But then they've kept the lightning connector on the smartphones, and then it's a lightning connector on the mouse, like the Magic Mouse, and then it's on the bottom of the mouse. And so when you're in a situation where you're like, well, I need to charge something, your chargers, you have different plugs for all the same devices that are theoretically, they should all be universal because there are smartphones, and apparently the iPad Pro is USB-C as well. So it should be universal, and they should have done it like when you make a decision. This is my recommendation to Apple. Of course, they're not going to listen. But like, if you're going to make a decision, just commit to it and just do it like a Band-Aid. Like, rip it off, do it all in one go. You're going to piss people off, but that's much better than prolonging the experience, making it more irritating to have multiple adapters, multiple ports, and you never have the right one. If you're going to go with USB-C or Thunderbolt 3, whatever it is, then just make it across the board all your devices, because it theoretically should work for all of them. But no, it's for like the keyboard and the Magic Mouse, it's the lightning connector, but the computer itself is USB-C/Thunderbolt 3. The phone is lightning, but now the iPad Pro is USB-C, and you just plug a hard drive into it, apparently. Is that what you're saying? And then if it's like a mobile one, does it get power from the iPad? Can you just have like a mobile like Lacy drive with USB-C? Continuity errors are hilarious. I mean, they are funny. I guess intentional, like they're definitely intentional in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but funny to see when it's unintentional in other films. I love watching wine bottle levels go up and down. Oh, in films and stuff where things are just constantly changing? Apple made a lot of money from adapters. Sure, yeah, they did. I'll end it there. I've been streaming for long enough. Thank you, everyone, for hanging out. Hopefully it was enjoyable. And check this stuff out. I mean, go check out some of these videos. This sounds really interesting as far as editing on an iPad Pro. Definitely remember the difference between 180-degree rule and shutter angle. Of course, find the motivation and passion to just like overcome all the COVID lockdown type stuff. Find the silver lining. Push yourself to make creative content, even with the restrictions in place. And if you're interested, check out the Zcam, because it's definitely in that right price point, and it may not be perfect for everybody, but it's just another option to consider as you're looking and evaluating, especially when there's this like new cameras coming to market and there's a lot of energy around the new stuff that's coming. Make sure you're aware of everything. Even the S1H, for as much as I constantly am talking about it, it's because that people just don't ever mention it. In a lot of the Canon stuff, reviews and people who've had hands-on with the R5 and R6, they make the excuse that, oh, well, it's a hybrid, it's a photo camera. These cameras don't do these features in this type of body. And it's like, yes, they do. The S1H has been out since September of last year. Are you not aware of this camera? Or if you are, why do you ignore it? Like, it does what you're talking about. So, and it does it without the flaws. Same thing with the A7S III that's coming. Also, it does those things without the flaws. So it's just interesting the perspectives you get from people where they kind of make excuses for Canon, and it doesn't seem to be justified from my perspective. I mean, it is. I've talked about it enough, but I find it odd that people are willing to give Canon a pass because it's a photography camera, and they ignore all the other photography cameras that also are proper hybrids that also do good video. So, end it there. Thank you, everyone. See you again next time.